Good evening. Tonight we begin with something a little less soothing than our usual stories. The complete history of smallpox, from its ancient beginnings to the extraordinary global campaign that finally ended the world's deadliest disease. Forget the neat heroic timeline you might have heard. Smallpox's path was messier, far more personal, and threaded through trade, war, faith, and quiet moments in ordinary homes. The truth is, if you were dropped into a town before vaccines, survival was never guaranteed. Smallpox struck quickly, left scars that lasted generations and could redraw the fate of families and nations alike. Before you get too comfortable, give the video a like and subscribe if you're enjoying it. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is on your end. It's incredible to see viewers joining in from every corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, and let's step into tonight's journey together. On the linen-wrapped face of Ramesses V, whose reign the Egyptians set down in stone more than 3 millennia ago, the marks are visible still. Tiny pits and depressions where flesh once held small cratered scars. Ancient embalmers smoothed and swathed his body, but the skin remembered. That memory has been a historian's first clue and a paleopathologist's tentative whisper, a human ledger of disease that so often left its bill at the end of a face. From those mummified remains, to the scrolls and palm leaf manuscripts of distant dynasties, to the cramped marginalia of medieval monks, the traces of a pox-like illness thread through human records. Yet the story of smallpox's deep past has always been half shadows and half lights. Archaeology and texts suggest presence. Molecular clocks and viral genomes argue over timing. And every new fragment, whether a snip of dried scab from an old physician's collection or a degraded strand of DNA from a 17th century corpse, redraws the map of when and where variola, the virus we call smallpox, began to mark human biology. It is seductive to say the disease has always been with us, because the marks are so old and the description so frequent. Egyptian mummies with pock marks have been pointed to again and again as proof of antiquity. Ramesses V, who died around 1157 BCE, is the poster child of such claims. Yet flesh that endures for millennia can deceive. The same depressions might be the result of other infections, scarring from different dermatological misfortunes or post-mortem damage. The veil of time distorts. Texts too are slippery. In China, the character Du, still read when people speak of smallpox, appears in classical medicine and folk lexica as early as the first millennium of the Common Era, attached to recipes and cautions about a fearful eruptive illness that swept children and adults alike. Indian Ayurvedic and classical Sanskrit texts include passages that modern readers can read as descriptions of pox-like diseases, collections of symptoms and remedies that do not always map tidy headlines onto our 21st century diagnostic categories. And in medieval Europe, chroniclers and physicians recorded pustular fevers, pox, the eruptive malady, in ways that are at once evocative and frustratingly non-specific. The word smallpox itself, the English coinage meant to distinguish the smaller pustules of variola from the great sores of syphilis, when that disease entered European discourse, belongs to a far later linguistic moment than the diseases it strove to name. Part of the debate is methodological. A written description of fever and a rash can be a small window into many illnesses. A hole in an ancient mummy's skin can be a map to a dozen different pathologies. Taphonomy, the study of what happens to organisms after death. And the biases of preservation means that some places, like the dry deserts of Egypt, keep skin better than damp northern bogs. Likewise, people who wrote about epidemics were sometimes trained as theologians and administrators rather than anatomists. Their metaphors sit in the same sentence as symptoms. For centuries, historians argued among themselves. Did the great pox that struck communities in late antiquity and the Middle Ages belong to the same lineage as the variola virus eradicated in 80? Or did it comprise a constellation of different pathogens that convergently produced pustular disease? Without genetic material, the argument was one of probabilities and plausibilities, of comparing symptom clusters and social consequences rather than definitively matching pathogen to parchment. The arrival of paleogenomics changed that arithmetic. When laboratories learned to coax ancient DNA from bone, skin and scab, and when high-throughput sequencing made it possible to read fleeting fragments, a new, braver layer of evidence became available. Scientists began to recover orthopox virus DNA from historical specimens that had been waiting in museum cabinets and church crypts. Bits of viral genome, heavily degraded and mixed with centuries of microbial noise, were assembled into larger sequences and compared to the panel of variola genomes that epidemiologists and public health laboratories had collected during the 20th century. Those 20th century sequences had suggested one picture, a relatively recent common ancestor for the strains that had circulated in modern times, implying rapid diversification in the last few centuries. Yet when geneticists stitched older sequences into phylogenetic trees, the branches changed direction. Genomes recovered from 17th and 18th century material in Northern Europe fell in unexpected places. Museum scabs kept as curiosities and the medical specimens in Victorian collections contained viral lineages not represented in 20th century sampling. The upshot was not a neat answer, but a richer and messier puzzle. Smallpox's genetic history is older and more diverse than earlier analyses had shown, and the temporal signal, the molecular clock, is more complicated than anyone had imagined. Short-term substitution rates measured among modern isolates do not always extrapolate cleanly back centuries, and the virus's evolutionary tempo is affected by host immunity, human movement, and cross-connections with other orthopox viruses that have long circulated in rodents, cattle, and camels. Those rodent and bovine cousins matter because they anchor the biologically plausible origin story. Variola sits at one node of the orthopox family tree, alongside cowpox, camelpox, monkeypox, and vaccinia. The latter a curious virus with a history entwined with human intervention. Human contact with animals has always offered the opportunity for viruses to jump species. Whether smallpox is millennia old or a few centuries younger, the context of zoonoses and the domestication of animals in the Neolithic sets the stage for more sustained zoonotic spillovers. But beyond those long evolutionary scales, what really made smallpox a historical force was its clinical character, the specific choreography of incubation, fever, eruption, and the cruel economy of survivorship and scarring. If paleogenomics whispers the disease's origins, the clinical portrait speaks aloud. Smallpox took time to reveal itself. After exposure there was a quiet interval, usually about a week, often 12 days on average, sometimes up to 3 weeks, in which the virus multiplied without drama. Then came the prodrome: fever, prostration, headache, backache, often vomiting. For some hours, sometimes days, people were merely very ill, as if a heavier than usual influenza had laid hold. Then the skin began to change. The rash that followed was not a sciatica of different age lesions like chickenpox, but a disciplined synchronous eruption, macules that rose into papules, papules that became firm, round vesicles that filled and thickened into deep-seated pustules, and finally crusts that would harden and fall away. The lesions had a peculiar geography, favouring the face, the forearms, the lower legs. They were centrifugal in distribution, more numerous at the periphery than on the trunk. That pattern was diagnostic even before microscopes named the culprit. The pustules were deep and often painful, and where they settled they left pits that time and sun would never fully erase. Clinically, physicians long distinguished two broad faces of the virus. Variola major was the meaner thing, more fever, larger rash, and a historical case fatality often cited around 30%. That figure has roots in successive generations of clinical observation and in the truth that mortality varied by age, by background immunity, and by the particular strain in circulation. Variola minor, sometimes called alastrim in older literature, was a gentler cousin, in most outbreaks producing a far lower fatality, often below 1%. But within variola major lurked further cruelty. The flat form, in which pustules failed to become raised, and the patient remained prostrate and often died, and the hemorrhagic form, in which bleeding into the skin and mucosa presaged catastrophe. Hemorrhagic smallpox, dark and fast, carried mortality near certainty and was particularly feared in communities where it appeared. For women who were pregnant, smallpox was especially unforgiving, increasing maternal mortality and consigning many fetuses to loss. The complications stacked up beyond a fatality count. Secondary bacterial infections of the pustules could eat into skin and deeper tissues. Corneal lesions could produce blindness through scarring. One of the sadder legacies of recovery was the lifelong disfigurement that left faces scored with pitted scars and limbs marked in ways visible at a glance. Survivors carried a visible history on their skins that shaped marriage prospects, social standing, and sometimes employment. In cultures where physical appearance mattered to social exchange, and that is to say human culture, the pocked face could become a scarlet letter of memory and survival. And behind those individual outcomes lay aggregate effects. In cities and countryside alike, recurring bouts of smallpox thinned labour pools, orphaned children, and shifted household economies. A harvest that lost a handful of experienced hands to an outbreak could falter. A textile workshop that depended on skilled artisans could lose apprentices in a single epidemic. An estate that suddenly had more widows than breadwinners recalibrated its relations and authority. In a pre-industrial economy where human labour was the main engine of production, disease was an economic variable as well as a biological one. Counting the dead is always an exercise in humility. Local records, parish registries, provincial accounts, and burial books give bursts of clarity. The year that a town recorded 100 more burials than expected, the ledger page annotated with smallpox beside the names, the orphan list that a parish had to muster, aggregated across centuries and continents, the numbers become staggering. In the 20th century alone, before eradication took hold, public health historians estimate that smallpox killed somewhere between 300 and 500 million people. That is not a glib statistic, it is a measure of human lives taken in mass and folded into the layers of our social history. In earlier centuries, smallpox often accounted for a significant share of childhood mortality in Europe. In some urban centres and provinces, a leading cause of death among children, responsible for perhaps 1 in 10 to 1 in 5 childhood deaths depending on the time and place. And its cumulative effect shaped demographic trajectories. Childhood survival was a keystone of family planning, labour, succession, and social reproduction. Smallpox's presence made that keystone shaky. Where immunity existed in a community, usually because the virus had been present for generations, the worst of the mortality came in childhood. Those who survived to adulthood bore some measure of immune memory. But when the virus moved into naive populations, societies with no prior exposure at all, the consequences were apocalyptic. The Americas, with its indigenous peoples more or less immunologically unfamiliar with Eurasian pox viruses, experienced waves of demographic collapse so deep they rewrote the map of human settlement. When smallpox arrived in the Caribbean in the early decades after 1492, when it struck Mexico in the years around 1520 and later rolled through the Andes in the 1520s and 1530s, the deaths were not a mere reduction in numbers, but a shattering of social orders. Entire towns emptied. Leadership hierarchies crumbled when chiefs and elders succumbed. Agricultural knowledge tied to local elders and lineages was lost, and labour systems that relied on dense populations became unworkable. The Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés had a very practical advantage in Mexico beyond swords. Disease. In 1520, an outbreak of smallpox in Tenochtitlan is historically attested and has been convincingly linked to the earlier arrival of African sais and European contacts. The illness killed thousands and struck at the heart of Aztec resistance, including the ruler Cuitlahuac, whose death undermined organized defense and created tactical openings the conquerors exploited. In the Andean highlands, smallpox arrival in the 1520s is associated with the death of Huayna Capac, an Inca emperor whose passing precipitated a succession crisis the Spanish were quick to exploit. These are not simple cause and effect stories. Human agency, politics, and technology all mattered, but disease had the peculiar power of transforming the balance of forces beneath the visible ones. Across the ocean in the Pacific and in Australia, smallpox also proved a grim partner to colonial expansion. When Captain Arthur Phillip and the First Fleet established a colony at Sydney in 1788, the British settlement was small, fragile, and ill-prepared for the epidemiological consequences of contact. Within a year, a devastating outbreak swept the coastal Aboriginal communities around Port Jackson. The Gadigal, Darug and other peoples paid a terrible price. Scholars still debate the precise vector that brought the virus ashore. Some argue for an introduction from the British camp or visiting sailors. Others point to contact with Macassan fishermen or other indirect routes of transmission. A darker hypothesis, long circulated in both academic and popular discourse, alleges intentional introduction, the giving of contaminated blankets or goods. The documentary heart of that argument lies elsewhere in the Anglo-colonial record. In 1763, during Pontiac's War, British officers at Fort Pitt corresponded about using smallpox against Native Americans. In a notorious exchange, Lord Geoffrey Amherst wrote to Colonel Henry Bouquet, recommending the inoculation of Indians by means of blankets that may fall into their hands, a phrase repeated in the historical record that chillingly captures a colonial calculus. At Fort Pitt, during negotiations aimed at ending conflict, blankets and a handkerchief taken from a smallpox hospital were given to native leaders. Whether that specific act produced the larger epidemics that swept the Ohio Valley is debate. Counting the complex web of movement and exposure is difficult, and yet the very existence of those letters shows a willingness among some imperial actors to consider disease as a tool. Intent and effect are not the same, but both lie in the unsettling possibility that microbial harm could be contemplated as a policy instrument. That willingness had practical antecedents. Europeans learned by experience and by observation in other lands that disease could be as decisive as bullets. In North America, the Continental Army during the American Revolution took measures born of hard lessons. George Washington, after witnessing how smallpox incapacitated troops, famously ordered mass inoculation of the Continental forces in 1777, a rare instance where military leadership prioritized immunological preparation in the teeth of war. In earlier decades, British and French armies in North America had watched entire units rendered ineffective by contagion. Armies were microcosms of social life in which disease could swamp discipline and supply, and thereby determine victory and defeat. In Asia and Africa, colonial administrations came to understand that maintaining a labouring population required attention to disease, sometimes through coercive campaigns to vaccinate, sometimes through neglect. The history of vaccination in colonies is a complicated one. Missionaries and medical officers sometimes brought immunity, but not always in a way that respected local consent. In other cases, vaccines were withheld or their distribution was shaped by political and economic priorities. Public health in the colonial context was never simply about bodies but about power. Smallpox's role as an instrument of imperial strategy also appears in subtler administrative forms. The ability of a state to track outbreaks, to isolate the sick in pox houses, and to enforce quarantines became part of early modern governance. Merchants and port authorities watched for signs of pox and required ships to produce certificates of health. Towns maintained lists of the dead and the infected. Boards of health in the Mediterranean ports and northern European cities tried to keep contagion from halting trade. These were not merely technical measures, but procedures that redistributed power. A governor who could keep an army healthy, or a colonial merchant who could keep his sailors inoculated, had an operational advantage. Conversely, deliberate failure to protect colonial subjects sometimes had economic logic. A plantation owner who refused to fund inoculation had a short-term saving, but risked a longer-term collapse in output when disease struck. The calculus was ugly and pragmatic. The history of smallpox, therefore, is also the history of administration, of how states learned to log bodies as statistics, to manage movement, and to treat health as a public good worth coercive measures in the name of the greater product. Among the more controversial episodes are attempts to weaponize the disease by the intentional transfer of infected material. The Fort Pitt incident is a notorious episode, cited often in studies of biological warfare long before the phrase became common. Elsewhere, in the shadow of empire, acculturated practices of gifting and negotiation could be corrupted into vectors of disease. On some occasions, colonists intentionally withheld remedies, or, when variolation and later vaccination became available, offered them selectively. The moral geometry of such decisions is stark. Public health knowledge, when unevenly applied, can become an axis of domination rather than a shared instrument of care. And yet there were also examples of medical knowledge being extended across cultural divides with life-saving effects, as in the instances where European inoculators performed variolation on willing indigenous communities or where local healers adopted elements of European treatment. The record is mixed, both charitable and shameful, attesting to the fact that disease and empire were not monoliths of malice, but arenas in which compassion, self-interest, ignorance, and cruelty all had a place. The scale of smallpox's geopolitical consequences is another constant. Where it reduced populations by death on the order of tens of percent, sometimes far more, the ability of indigenous polities to resist foreign encroachment was diminished. The collapse of labour-intensive systems, the disruption of ritual and agricultural calendars, and the decapitation of leadership all had cascading effects. In many parts of the New World, the demographic collapse following European arrival was measured in decades. Regions that had supported large polities were suddenly thinly settled and easier for outsiders to appropriate. In the larger theatres of Eurasian history, where immunity was more widespread and disease endemic, smallpox nevertheless shaped armies and the fiscal capacity of states. Recurrent epidemics could sap manpower and drain treasuries. The Habsburgs, the Ottomans, and the Qing all had to reckon with recurring waves of epidemic disease that shaped military campaigns and fiscal choices. That is to say, disease did not merely kill, it shifted logistical equations, sometimes altering the timetables of diplomacy and warfare. And so the narrative of smallpox is as much a political one as it is a biological or medical chronicle. It is a story of how a microscopic agent, indifferent and patient, could intersect with voyages of exploration, patterns of trade, the calculation of commanders, and the administration of empires. It is a tale told in the thin bones of mummies and in the ink of court records, in the stitches where scabs were preserved as medical curiosities, and in the letters of generals who contemplated the use of disease as a weapon. Each new scientific technique, each paleogenomic sequence, each forensic re-examination of a mummy, each rediscovered archive, has adjusted the margin of the story, moving dates back or forward, revising our sense of the deep past and of the immediate effect. But the essential human truth remains simple and stubborn. Smallpox was never merely a list of symptoms. It was a social event. It decided marriages as well as wars. It shaped procedures at ports as much as battlefield tactics, and it altered the lives of countless families from the Nile to the Mississippi, from the high Andes to the east coast of Australia. There is an ironic subtlety to this history. A pathogen that seemed so systematically cruel was, in its epidemiological form, not a monolithic weapon, but a complex interaction between virus and social structure. In places where communities had learned to live with the virus, its force was chiselled into calendars and customs. In places where it arrived with conquest, its blow could be catastrophic and swift. Modern genetic sleuthing has made the past louder and more precise, but it has also revealed the limits of certainty. Ancient genomes remind us that our narratives can be revised. They rescue stories from the fog, but also multiply the fog by revealing how much we did not know. For the historian with a bedside lamp and the scientist with a sequencer, smallpox is both a cautionary and clarifying subject. A reminder that biological events are always braided into human choices, and that every attempt to pin history to a single cause will find itself face to face with the messiness of human life. So when you close your eyes on the record of smallpox, When you look at the pitted face of an ancient ruler or the marginal note in a medieval ledger, remember this: you're not only seeing disease, you're seeing consequence. You're seeing how a virus, mute and unasked, became a partner in empire, a factor in economics, a shaper of lineage and law. You're seeing why its eradication was not merely a medical triumph, but a rewiring of human history, an outcome wrested from centuries of shadow, and from the patient accumulation of observation, experiment, and sometimes stubborn, humane persuasion. Smallpox, in the end, became a point at which science, politics, and human will intersected decisively. Before that moment, the clinical terror and the geopolitical ripple worked together to make it one of the deadliest actors on our shared stage. After that moment, the actors changed, and the stage looked different. But we reached that future only after the centuries of traces, the mummified skin and the scratched manuscripts, and the modern genomes that finally made the past speak with more than a single, uncertain voice. In the cool shadow of courtyard houses and the warm light of kitchen fires, long before microscopes and laboratories carved the world into cells and viruses, human beings practiced their own fragile engineering against a cruel and familiar fate. Mothers learned by doing. Wise women learned by watching. In China and parts of the Ottoman world, in the villages of West Africa, and in the rich tapestry of South Asia, people who had watched generations come and go noticed a pattern. Those who survived a mild dose of smallpox rarely fell prey twice. They took that observation and turned it into ritual and method, and in doing so laid a patient, imperfect groundwork for what would become modern prevention. The techniques were not uniform. In the high houses of Beijing and the river towns beyond, texts from the Ming and Qing eras record methods of inoculation that sometimes involve the careful drying of smallpox scabs into powder and the gentle insufflation of this into the nose, a puff of disease administered like a seasoning, an odd culinary metaphor for a grim purpose. In the bazaars and compounds of the Ottoman capital Constantinople, the practice most commonly took the simpler, more direct form of variolation: a minute incision in the skin, the introduction of material from an active pustule, and then wait. Mothers and local practitioners, sometimes called manipulators and sometimes inoculators, watched for a fever, watched for a few pustules, and then, if things follow the pattern of luck and skill, a healed child who might henceforth be spared the devastation of a later epidemic. In parts of West Africa, the Mandinka and other groups had long used forms of inoculation. Enslaved Africans carried that knowledge across the Atlantic, and in Boston in 1706 a man named Onesimus told his master, the Puritan minister Cotton Mather, of an African practice that prevented smallpox. Mather, ever curious and ever textual, tucked the knowledge away and later, in the terrifying 1721 epidemic that struck Boston, urged its application. The method's appeal was pragmatic and immediate. Natural smallpox, when it arrived, could decimate a village, leaving behind empty beds and a lopsided demography. Variolation, performed carefully, produced a much milder episode in most people and a subsequent immunity. For those who practiced it, the calculus was stark and simple. A controlled, usually less deadly infection, now to avoid the lottery of epidemic death later. To the trained eye of a healer who had seen the fever and scarring of smallpox, this made sense. Statistical voices soon began to make the point quantitatively. By the middle of the 18th century, physicians such as James Durin were gathering numbers and arguing that mortality among the variolated was a fraction of that among the naturally infected, converting empirical saving into a statistical argument. That argument, variolation carried risk, yes, but saved lives on balance, would be the hinge upon which later safer methods turned. It was also, however, an idea that provoked discomfort, moral wrestling and political contest. To variolate someone was to intervene on what many devout people felt was a providential order. Critics in pulpit and parliament asked whether it was right to interfere with God's will. Doctors objected too, on practical grounds. The practice sometimes generated full-blown smallpox in the inoculated person, and inoculated patients could and did seed new outbreaks. A man in London who had been inoculated might recover, and then, on a crowded coach ride, infect others. The poor sometimes could not afford the procedure, and the rich sometimes used it as a mark of sensible parenting, a social divide as blunt as any public policy. Seasoned healers fretted about standards. What if the scab came from a virulent case and not a mild one? What if the operator was careless? These were not merely philosophical objections. Variolation could and did kill, at much lower rates than smallpox, but enough to excite worry and outrage. It generated pamphlets and sermons, petitions and edicts, and in some places even riots. The moral world and the practical world tangled over a single harrowing problem: how to keep life going when the cost of inaction was so often death. One of the most dramatic intersections of travel, observation and persuasion occurred in the person of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. In 1717 she lived in Constantinople as the wife of the British ambassador, and she watched with the clarity and curiosity of a literate traveller the Ottoman practice of inoculation. She watched healers take smallpox material, open the skin and render a child, by modern standards a dangerous experiment, safer, and she wrote of it in letters that would be read in time across the English-speaking world. She herself had endured smallpox and the facial scarring it leaves. She wrote with the urgent authority of someone who had seen both sides of the coin. In 1718 and the years following, through persuasion and her own force of personality, she saw her children inoculated. One account places a son's inoculation in Constantinople and a daughter's in London when she returned, and she enlisted physicians such as Dr. Charles Maitland to demonstrate the practice in Britain. The demonstrators were not careful technicians in sterile rooms, but sensible practitioners hurrying against fear. Yet their work began to strip away the notion that the practice was solely foreign superstition. It became a subject of debate among the learned men of the Royal Society, and then, slowly, a thing that Londoners and Bostonians and others could imagine as a humane option against an otherwise ruthless disease. Across the Atlantic, the drama took on a Puritan cadence. Onesimus's story, told to Cotton Mather in 1706, would germinate in Mather's mind, and when the 1721 Boston epidemic arrived, he urged its use. Zabdiel Boylston, a Boston physician, put the theory into practice, inoculating his own son, 2 of his slaves, and then other volunteers. The city looked on with a mixture of horror and hope. Some accused the doctors of murder. Boylston was threatened. His name was spat on in the streets. Still, the numbers were persuasive. Those inoculated fared better than those who contracted smallpox naturally. The medicine of the time was equal parts careful observation and improvisation, but it had found an edge. Imperfect, uneven, morally complicated, yes, but an edge all the same. Variolation showed that immunity could be induced. That simple concept, teach the body what to fear so it will not later be undone by it, would be a seed that germinated in the hands of a country doctor 3/4 of a century later. Edward Jenner was not a revolutionary by inclination. He was a careful rural physician in the village of Berkeley in Gloucestershire, with a love for natural history, meticulous temperament, and a steady curiosity about the world. In the 1790s, he heard the same folk observation that had circulated for years. Milkmaids who contracted cowpox from the cattle they milked rarely contracted smallpox. The sight of milkmaids' hands, tender, marked with blisters, the livelihood of their work, was for Jenner a clue that something biological and protective was at work. He collected stories. He followed leads. He read the scattered reports that said one disease might ward off another. And then, in the spring of 1796, he acted. On May 14, 1776, Jenner took material from the cowpox lesion of a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms and introduced it into an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. The boy suffered a short fever and developed the expected local sores and then healed. Jenner waited and later deliberately exposed the boy to smallpox material to test whether the earlier cowpox had indeed protected him. The boy did not get smallpox. Jenner repeated the experiment with others, documented the cases, and in 1798 published an inquiry into the causes and effects of the variolae vaccinae. He coined a word that would travel the globe: vaccine. From vacca, Latin for cow. Simple, elegant, resonant. The idea hit a world that was intellectually hungry and socially ripe. The immediate appeal was obvious. Here was a method that seemed to confer protection without the calculated risk of variolation. For a physician or a parent, the choice between insulating a child with cowpox, mild, predictable, and exposing them to the smallpox virus itself was not hard to make. Jenner's work was not immediately accepted without dispute. Some physicians worried that use of cow-derived material was unnatural or dangerous. Some critics derided the idea with low, cruel jokes. Would people sprout cowish habits? Others, however, saw in Jenner's work a practical salvation. The rich and the powerful took note. Governments and philanthropists were quick to provide patronage where they could, recognizing a means to prevent a disease that had tormented armies, colonies, and economies. The practical spread of vaccination across continents was as much an exercise in logistics and human improvisation as in scientific persuasion. One of the most dramatic early expeditions was Spanish, the Royal Philanthropic Vaccine Expedition led by Francisco Javier de Balme in 1803. The Spanish crown, anxious to protect its colonies and conscious of the good publicity a humanitarian mission might bring, organized a voyage that would transport vaccination to the Americas and beyond. There was, of course, a problem. The vaccine material, live virus, needed to be fresh. In an age before refrigeration and freeze-drying, the Spanish solution was grimly ingenious. They carried living vaccine in a chain of children, orphaned boys who were vaccinated in sequence so that the material could be passed arm to arm across the Atlantic and then onward to ports in the Caribbean, Mexico, South America, and eventually the Philippines. The expedition's ships carried not only surgeons and medicine chests, but also children with healing scabs, human vials, alive and travelling to serve as the means of transmission. It was philanthropy dressed up in the technology of its time, pragmatic and ethically awkward to our modern eyes, and it worked. The expedition planted the seed of vaccination across far-flung territories, and the idea that vaccination could be a public governmental responsibility took root. In the United States, too, vaccination was taken up with zeal. Benjamin Waterhouse, a physician at Harvard, corresponded with Jenner, and in 1800 introduced Jennerian vaccine to Boston. The new method spread in fits and starts, clerk by clerk, town by town, physician by physician, and the docility of the cowpox relative matter, compared to smallpox itself, encouraged its adoption. By the early 19th century, vaccination societies and dispensaries offered vaccine to those who could not afford it, and governments began to see vaccination not merely as private medicine, but as a public good that could be distributed. The transition from folk wisdom to institutionalized practice was not immediate, but it was underway. The idea of induced immunity had crossed from an empirical trick to a public health instrument. Scientific reaction was mixed, but quickly productive. Jenner had provided case studies and reasoned argument, but not a laboratory proof of mechanism. Germ theory and immunology had not yet been developed, so scientists and clinicians debated, reproduced, and refined. Why did cowpox protect? What were the long-term effects? How long would immunity last? These were pressing questions. More practically, physicians confronted production issues, how to keep vaccine viable in transit, how to prevent contamination, how to scale up supply beyond ad hoc human carriers. In the 19th century, the practice of arm-to-arm transfer, using human donors as carriers, dominated because it was simple and effective at keeping the virus alive for short journeys. But it had drawbacks. It could carry other human pathogens, including syphilis, and it relied upon a chain of infected and then healthy donors that was neither hygienic nor scalable. The movement towards production in animals, principally calves, was a crucial technical turning point. From the mid-19th century onward, manufacturing shifted from the precarious human chain to more controlled animal propagation. Calves were inoculated under controlled conditions, allowed to develop the characteristic pox, and lymph harvested under sanitary conditions. The change was driven by public health sensibility and by mounting evidence that human-to-human transfers sometimes spread other diseases. Calf lymph production offered greater consistency, the possibility of standardization, and a retreat from the morally fraught use of children and human donors. It was not a single inventor's triumph, but an incremental industrialization. Veterinarians and physicians, often in cooperation with later forming national vaccine institutes, refined the methods so the product could be made reliably and in bulk. Industrial manufacture brought with it the mundane but crucial work of quality control. No longer was a vaccine vial simply a tiny miracle in a physician's pocket. It became a product to be tested, standardized, and regulated. Potency assays, initially biological tests that checked for pock formation in animals, developed into more exacting procedures. Sterility became a preoccupation. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, advances in aseptic technique and germ theory, Listerian antisepsis and Pasteur's work on microbes, reshaped vaccine production, making it safer and cleaner. Private companies and state laboratories sprang up to supply governments, and the vaccine trade became an early showcase of the intersection between public health and industry. Two technical innovations of the 20th century would prove decisive. The first was the modification of vaccine lymph with glycerol. Glycerination, introduced in the early decades of the 1900s and refined over time, served two purposes. It acted as a preservative and as an antiseptic, reducing bacterial contamination in the lymph and extending shelf life. The thick, slightly sweet-smelling glycerinated fluid could be stored for longer, shipped with less risk of spoiling, and handled by a broader array of medical personnel. The second was freeze-drying lyophilization, which arrived as a practical manufacturing method by mid-century. Lyophilized vaccine was dry, stable, and far less fragile than fresh lymph. It could be packed in small glass ampules, stored for months without a strict cold chain, and then reconstituted at the point of use. These changes together turned a fragile biological product into something robust enough to be handled on ships, in military campaigns, and in remote clinics. But storage, transportation, and field delivery still posed thorny problems. Vaccines, even when glycerinated or freeze-dried, had to endure the world. Heat in equatorial ships, bumpy roads, careless luggage, the long delays of colonial administration. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, vaccine distributors experimented with ice boxes, insulated crates, and logistical planning that reads like early supply chain management. National laboratories and commercial firms competed and collaborated to create standards for packaging, potency tests, and shipping protocols. The chain of custody for a vial, from farm to factory to ship to clinic, had to be reliable if vaccination was to be a reliable public health instrument. That required trained personnel, money and state capacity, a distribution network as much as a medical one. The final pragmatic stroke that enabled mass campaigns of vaccination was not an idea but a tool, the bifurcated needle, invented by Dr. Moore. Benjamin Rubin at Wyeth Laboratories in the mid-1960s, the bifurcated needle was a small forked instrument of astonishing elegance. It held a tiny droplet of reconstituted vaccine between its tines and delivered it by a quick multiple prick scarification of the skin. It used far less vaccine per person than earlier methods, was cheap to manufacture, easy to sterilize, and speeded vaccination dramatically. One vaccinator could reach many more people per hour. The needle's design also standardized the dose in a way that older lancets could not. For mass campaigns, where the difference between covering a population and failing to do so often came down to how many arms a single team could reach in a day, the bifurcated needle was revolutionary. The confluence of these technologies, calf lymph production, glycerination, freeze-drying, and the bifurcated needle, meant that vaccination had become not just a medical curiosity, but a logistic reality. Vaccination was no longer limited to the wealthy, the brave, or the geographically lucky. It could be planned, budgeted for, produced in millions of doses, and delivered into places where smallpox had once been accepted as inevitable. Governments and the international organizations could conceive of campaigns that were logistical, not merely clinical, designate teams, manufacture standardized vaccine, ship it in insulated boxes or stable dry vials, train vaccinators in scarification with the bifurcated needle, and keep records. Surveillance could be layered on top of distribution, the work of identifying outbreaks, tracing contacts, and deploying rapid response vaccination teams, because the tools existed to deliver vaccines swiftly and reliably. That transformation was not merely technical, it was cultural. The image of vaccination shifted from a risky trial to a civic duty, from a foreign curiosity to a standard public service. Public health departments grew organs for vaccine procurement and distribution, sometimes in the teeth of political resistance. Many campaigns required imaginative logistics. Trains carried vials inland, ships crossed oceans with vaccine banks in refrigerated holds or with patients used as living carriers when no better option existed. And more recently, planes and motor vehicles zipped kits into villages. Each of these steps required not only the cold science of the laboratory, but the warm human work of organization. Clerks keeping records, drivers following maps, nurses calming children, bureaucrats balancing budgets. Technology had solved many of the biological problems. Logistics solved the rest. And there were still hard trade-offs. The arm-to-arm methods that had spread vaccination in the 19th century were now seen as dangerous relics for their tendency to move human-borne infections. Calf lymph production reduced that risk but required veterinary oversight and more capital. Glycerination helped with stability but required consistent manufacturing standards to avoid variations in potency. Freeze-drying permitted easier transport but demanded clean water and sterile diluents in the field to reconstitute vials, no small matter in a drought-riven region. The bifurcated needle made delivery economical, but it also changed clinical practice, requiring training and oversight so that the take rate of vaccination could be monitored. Quality control, in short, never ceased to be a problem. To see how these technical tweaks added up to a revolution, imagine two public health worlds, one in which newborns were vulnerable, vaccines fragile, and distribution sporadic, and another in which a trained team could move into a village, arrive with hundreds of freeze-dried vials, reconstitute them cleanly, and, with a dozen bifurcated needles, vaccinate thousands in a week. The difference is not merely logistical. The second world allows for strategy. Vaccination becomes a weapon for containment. It can be targeted, intense, and temporary but deployed at scale. That is the moment when prevention graduates from the domain of charity into the domain of policy, where ministries of health can plan campaigns, and where international bodies can contemplate eradication as a project rather than a pious dream. The history of these developments is a study in slow, pragmatic accretion. Folklore and practice in far-flung villages suggested a hypothesis. Travellers and colonial encounters carried that hypothesis into the salons and lecture halls of Europe and into the minds of curious physicians. Experiments in the field, often messy, rarely pristine, turned insight into claim. Jenner's patient experiments provided a clean narrative and a persuasive method. Industrialization turned the method into the supply. Preservation techniques turned supply into a commodity that could be shipped. And finally, simple mechanical innovation, the little bifurcated fork, turned the commodity into an action that could be delivered quickly to many hands. Each step solved a problem left by the last. The historical arc moves from the kitchen to the clinic, from the bazaar to the laboratory, from manual carriers to standardized vials. It is worth dwelling a moment on the moral contours of that arc. Each technological advance was accompanied by questions about ethics, equity, and authority. The use of orphan children as live carriers by the Balmis expedition looks today like philanthropy crossed with exploitation. The shift to calf lymph was welcomed by those who feared human-to-human contamination, but raised issues about animal welfare and industrialized medicine. The creation of national vaccine factories centralized power over life-saving material and shifted the basic question of access towards state responsibility. And yet there is a simpler human truth beneath the complexities. Each innovation saved lives by removing obstacles to access and safety. The measure of success in these centuries was not novelty but deployment. How many people were actually reached, protected, and allowed to live past childhood? By the middle of the 20th century, the toolkit that had evolved from that long, halting history was robust enough to permit what in earlier centuries had seemed a miracle: the systematic, large-scale suppression of smallpox wherever the will and resources for action were concentrated. Calf lymph production produced bulk supplies under controlled conditions. Glycerinated and lyophilized vaccines held potency in transit. The bifurcated needle conserved dose and sped delivery. And an evolving cold chain, ice boxes, insulated crates, eventually refrigerated trucks and aircraft, tied the system together. These technologies, combined with better surveillance and a new era of international cooperation, converted the theoretical promise of an induced immunity into a practical, repeatable program. The story of smallpox prevention, which began with kitchen hearths and old women's hands, had become the story of coordinated manufacture, meticulous preservation, and mass application. It is a quiet, cumulative tale, full of small human choices that add up to global consequence. The needle's fork, the glycerol's viscous sweetness, the ampule's fragile glass, all are modest artifacts when compared with the life they saved. The history does not read like a single heroic moment, but like a patient accretion, observation, adaptation, institutionalization, refinement. That accretion carried society from the risky, improvised theatre of variolation, its bright but dangerous promise, to the far more disciplined, distributed world of organized vaccination. In that long movement, the world learned to manufacture certainty in doses, to ship hope in glass vials, and to make prevention not merely an idea but an operational capability. And so the tale moves onward. The craftsmen of prevention, the healers and the bureaucrats, the curious physicians and the anonymous factory hands, all together fashioned a system that could be deployed across continents. It required courage, not always tidy. It required humility, because every new technique brought new complications, and it required a faith in collective action that is not sentimental, but practical. From the markets of Constantinople to the Welsh countryside where champions like Jenner worked, and through the laboratories and docks and orphaned decks of the sea where vaccine travelled, humanity learned again and again how to turn a little biological insight into a public instrument. The rest of the story is about scale and surveillance, and the final decisions to take this instrument and aim it relentlessly toward eradication. But those are chapters of their own. What sustains us here is the slow, tender logic of prevention, that through observation, improvisation, and incremental invention, people learn to build a ladder out of danger rung by careful rung. The campaign to compel a puncture became, in the long 19th century, a test of what modern states expected of their citizens, and what citizens could expect from their states. And it is here, among courtrooms that smelled faintly of ink and disinfectant, in the pamphlets handed out on market days, in the curt encounters between vaccinators and the poor on doorsteps, that one finds the political heart of the smallpox story. The vaccine that Edward Jenner coaxed into being at the end of the 18th century promised a simple mercy, a cowpox scratch that left a scar and often a lifetime of protection. But a promise is a social thing, as well as a biological one, and where the state moved to make that promise compulsory, the response could be fierce. Britain, the nation that first passed a national law obliging parents to have infants vaccinated, did so with the Vaccination Act of 1853 and the Act's enforcement, fines for non-compliance and the appointment of vaccination officers who could enter households, transformed a medical technique into a public duty that some interpreted as an assault on bodily autonomy and on local custom. That assault was, for many, literal. The vaccinator's finger, the syringe or lancet, a stranger's hands visiting the nursery, These intimate intrusions became symbols of the reach of the modern state. For working-class families already squeezed by industrial rhythms and poor housing, a visit from the vaccination inspector added another tick to the ledger of surveillance and punishment. Those who organised against compulsion thereafter marshalled arguments familiar to us now: liberty, parental rights, religious freedom. But they also invoke the very real anxieties of the age, that the lymph used for vaccination had sometimes been transferred arm to arm, and in doing so had conveyed syphilis or other infections, that vaccines manufactured and handled in ways few people could watch might do as much harm as good, that governments and municipal authorities, notoriously careless in the distribution of relief and sanitation, were suddenly eager to order the entrails of bodies. The anti-vaccination movement was therefore not a single thing. It was a mosaic, composed of small-town dissent, metropolitan organising, religious objections, scientific scepticism, and a streak of libertarian theory. Individuals like William Tebb, a British activist who travelled and wrote extensively on the subject in the late 19th century, gave a transnational shape to dissent. Periodicals and leagues exchanged reports across the English-speaking world and beyond. In towns and cities from Leicester to Liverpool, from Boston to Melbourne, committees formed, petitioned, and sometimes marched. Their rhetoric was often pitched to the language of rights and conscience. In Leicester, where municipal authorities for a long time resisted the more draconian tactics of central government, the conflict took on a municipal cast. The town became, quite intentionally, a laboratory of alternatives, where local officials experimented with isolation, notification and meticulous case-finding, rather than the strict enforcement of infant vaccination. Supporters of the town's shadow strategy claimed reduced mortality. Opponents accused the municipality of shirking duty and endangering neighbouring jurisdictions. Both sides had statistics to wave like talismans. Both misinterpreted numbers with zeal. Medicine did not speak alone in these quarrels. The law answered, and the courts were the place where the social ledger was finally balanced, or at least tried. It is hard to overstate the significance in the Anglophone world of the United States Supreme Court decision in Jacobson v. Massachusetts in 1905. The case, arising out of a Cambridge, Massachusetts ordinance that authorized a $5 fine for adults refusing smallpox vaccination during an outbreak, was brought by Henning Jacobson, who refused on the grounds of personal liberty and an earlier adverse reaction. The court, deeply conscious of the competing claims of individual freedom and public safety, sided with the Commonwealth. The Jacobson ruling enshrined a principle that would echo through public health law for a century. The state possessed a police power to enact reasonable regulations to protect the community's health, even if those regulations curtailed individual liberty. The opinion, measured and cautious in tone, did not say liberty could be extinguished. Rather, it declared that liberty, in a functioning polity, must be balanced against communal preservation. Across the Atlantic, law and politics took a different shape. Britain's own legal trajectory had been one of tightening control, followed by grudging concession. The Royal Commission on Vaccination, sitting from 1889 to 1896, was the product of sustained public agitation and partisan pressure. Its hearings filled rooms, its minutes record a parade of mothers, doctors and municipal officials, of vivid anecdotes and grim statistics. The Commission's deliberations revealed the uncomfortable truth that vaccination programs in the 19th century were often imperfectly implemented, poorly kept vaccine, sloppy technique, inadequate follow-up, and that those imperfections fed distrust. Out of this contentious atmosphere grew the Vaccination Act of 1898, which introduced a conscience clause, allowing for exemption on grounds of personal belief. It was a remarkable compromise. The state conceded a formal allowance for refusal, even as it continued to endorse vaccination, and the concession underlined that public health is as much about consent as about coercion. Class, religion and politics determined which families accepted the vaccine and which rejected it. The liberal stratum that dominated certain professional and commercial elites tended to regard vaccination as modern and sensible. The university-trained physician, was more likely to embrace Jenner's legacy. Many working-class families, however, read the situation differently. When basic housing and sanitation were lacking, when the workhouse loomed as a possibility, when the local municipal officer was the face of the state, a puncture could be read as yet another instrument of domination. Religious objections ranged widely. Some sectarian groups, including certain splinters of Congregationalists and newer movements like Christian Science, resisted vaccination on the grounds of spiritual purity or non-interference with divine providence. In colonies and among immigrant communities, religious and cultural objections mingled with suspicion of foreign technicians and with anxieties about material used in vaccines, whether it declared itself to be the product of cows, or if humans touched by lower caste hands could provoke real offence. Politics, too, was present in every vaccination drive. Governments used prophylaxis not only to save lives, but to secure labour and maintain order. Armies were vaccinated to preserve fighting strength. Dock workers and sailors were inoculated to keep trade flowing. The extension of municipal powers in the 19th century, the establishment of boards of health, the passage of public health acts in Britain and the United States, the creation of quarantine stations at ports, made vaccination one of the visible interfaces between citizen and state. It was often the poor who bore the brunt of policy. Penalties for non-compliance, enforced by police and sometimes by the poor law, fed resentments that anti-vaccination entrepreneurs could exploit. Slogans and cartoons made the point with brutal economy. Caricatures showed the state transferring its authority into a syringe. The same technological revolution that spread opposition also amplified vaccination itself. Railways, steamships and improved communications meant that both a pamphlet and a virus could traverse a continent within a day. Ships carrying migrants and soldiers could seed outbreaks in port cities. Rail networks carried infected people from docks to inner districts. The dense wards of Glasgow, Calcutta and New York became the theatres of periodic urban eruptions of smallpox. The 19th century city, with its new iron skeleton and crowded tenements, offered smallpox the precise condition it required. Pockets of susceptible people living cheek by jowl with one another and with the constant flow of outsiders. Public health responses adapted, sometimes with compassion, sometimes with blunt coercion. Isolation hospitals, fever sheds and quarantine stations were built on city fringes and on islands. Registers of cases were kept. House-to-house search became nightly routine during outbreaks. The needle moved through these urban geographies the way public policy itself did, at times heavy-handed and resented, at other times welcomed as protection. The colonial world presented a different, sometimes darker choreography. In India, across West Africa and in the Pacific, the imposition of vaccination policies intersected with the violences and humiliations of imperial rule. Colonial administrators frequently justified vaccination campaigns as acts of benevolence, civilizing operations to protect subject populations, but those same campaigns were sometimes the instruments of control. Vaccinators, often military men or colonial officers, moved through villages with lists, with order, and with little regard for local ritual or hierarchy. In many places, the technique of vaccination, touching the arm, breaching the skin with a lancet, encountered notions of purity and pollution that colonial officials misread as ignorance. The reality was more complex. Certain communities accepted vaccination readily when it was delivered with respect and when tangible benefits were clear. Other communities resisted where the procedure was performed by outsiders in the wrong gender, by the wrong caste, or in ways that implied a stolen body. Missionaries were sometimes mediators, sometimes co-opted instruments. The rhetoric of humanitarianism, which painted vaccination as an act of pious generosity, did not erase the fact that it often arrived attached to soldiers, taxation and conscription. Logistics, which we might call the mathematics of mercy, were a central problem across empire. Maintaining viable vaccine lymph across months at sea and in the heat of the tropics taxed 19th century technology. Arm-to-arm transfer using human donors whose lymph would be taken fresh and applied to the next person was one pragmatic solution, but one with perverse side effects, including the occasional transmission of other pathogens. The search for more reliable supplies led to the development of animal-based vaccine production, calf lymph raised on vaccine farms in northern Europe and then shipped to colonial ports, and to the creation eventually of institutional vaccine producers, laboratories attached to colonial medical services, and to institutions like the Institut Pasteur. In the late 19th century, the British established medical schools and tropical medicine programs. Liverpool's School of Tropical Medicine, founded 1898, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, founded 1899, precisely because empire demanded not only soldiers but scientific knowledge. Those schools trained technicians and conceived of public health not only as medicine but as administration. The goal was to render populations legible and therefore governable. This governance carried contradictions. Where public health officials sought to rationalize disease control, social reformers insisted that sanitation and housing mattered as much as inoculation. In municipal debates, boosters of vaccination argued with advocates of better water and sewage. Both sides were right. Smallpox, unlike cholera, was not primarily spread by foul water. It travelled by close contact and fell hardest where people slept closely and where social support was weak. But improvements in housing and nutrition did reduce vulnerability and helped amplify the protective effect of vaccination programs. The story of urban and colonial smallpox is therefore never merely a tale of needles and law. It is a story of infrastructures, railways, hospitals, vaccine depots, and the intangible infrastructure of trust. By the early 20th century, the biological sciences began to illuminate the machine of the virus itself with new clarity, and that illumination changed the calculus. Variola virus belongs to the orthopoxvirus genus within the larger poxvirus family, a clan of comparatively large brick-like viruses whose size and complexity place them in a different register to the nimble RNA viruses that most frequently seize headlines. Under the electron microscope, a poxvirus looks substantial, more like a tiny loaf than a single spike, and this heft is reflected in its genome. Variola's genetic material is double-stranded DNA, linear rather than segmented, and unusually large, on the order of roughly 186 kilobases, encoding well over 100 proteins. Equally important was where the virus performs its work. Unlike most DNA viruses, poxviruses carry their replication machinery with them. They replicate in the cytoplasm of the infected cell, and therefore must bring their own tools for transcription and genome replication. The result is a virus that is, in some sense, self-sufficient. An organella parasite that carries with it much of what it needs to make more of itself. That genomic largesse came with strategic consequences. Variola's genome contains numerous genes dedicated not simply to copying itself, but to manipulating the host immune response. It makes proteins that bind cytokines, that mop up complement, and that interfere with interferon signaling. It expresses secreted decoy receptors that distract immune factors. Some of these genes are closely tailored to human molecules, which helps explain why variola is a species specialist. It has evolved over centuries or more to fit the contours of human immunity. Species specificity has a moral. It made eradication possible. Disease that requires a human host and has no animal reservoir is, unlike zoonoses, in principle exorcisable. Cut off human chains of transmission and the virus will die out. The clinical face of variola reflected this tight human choreography. Ordinary smallpox followed a recognizable sequence. Fever, a centrifugal rash that emerged first on the face and arms and then moved in synchrony over the trunk, the progression of papules to pustules with a typical uniformity that made smallpox diagnostically distinct from chickenpox, which scatters lesions at different stages. But variola could also assume dreadful guises. The hemorrhagic and flat forms of the disease carried very high fatality, and the appearance of confluent lesions on a child's face could be socially devastating, leaving survivors disfigured and often rejected. There were two broad clinical phenotypes often spoken of in 19th and 20th century epidemiology: variola major, the more virulent option with case fatality that could reach 30% or higher in unprotected populations, and variola minor, sometimes called alastrim, which was milder and considerably less deadly. The geographic distribution of these forms was uneven, and that unevenness shaped local and international fear. The molecular age began in the late 20th century to measure that unevenness with precision. Whole genome sequencing of 20th century isolates, material preserved in laboratory collections, in cartridges and on glass slides, allowed virologists to compare strains and to build family trees. In the early years of the 21st century, advances in ancient DNA techniques pushed this farther still. Researchers successfully extracted variola genetic material from historical scabs and museum collections, and these sequences revealed that strains circulating in earlier centuries were sometimes genetically distinct from those that dominated the 20th century. The genomic evidence suggested, somewhat counterintuitively, that the modern 20th century clade of variola, the lineage that public health workers battled across South Asia, Africa and beyond in the 20th century, might have been a relatively recent radiation, expanding into global prominence in the last few centuries. That insight did not erase the deep history of smallpox's human toll. Rather, it complicated the narrative, showing that the virus's population dynamics, like the history of its human hosts, shifted with trade, war, and migration. Sequencing did more than rewrite histories. It served operational ends. In the 1960s and 1970s, as the World Health Organization mounted the global eradication campaign, laboratory techniques including restriction fragment profiling and later PCR-based methods enabled epidemiologists to distinguish vaccinal reactions from true variola infections, to trace the likely source of an outbreak, and to confirm chains of transmission in the last critical weeks of elimination. Genomic data also helpfully differentiated variola from its cousins, vaccinia, cowpox and monkeypox, an increasingly important distinction as attention turned to zoonotic pox viruses, whose clinical manifestations could mimic smallpox. In the post-eradication era, having a library of sequences meant that the emergency diagnostics could be calibrated rapidly should the unimaginable occur. The sequence of the virus also taught scientists which parts of the genome did the heavy lifting of virulence and immune subversion. Genes encoding secreted proteins that mimic host cytokine receptors, genes that bind complement or interfere with antigen presentation, stood out as logical candidates for study, and in turn these studies underpinned two practical advances: the development of safer vaccines and the search for antivirals. Vaccinia, the live virus used in vaccination, is not identical to variola. Its origins are somewhat murky. Ancestral cowpox, horsepox and related viruses all played roles in the unfolding history of the vaccine strain, but the immunological cross-protection it afforded proved sufficient to blunt variola's attack. Genomic insights allowed vaccine researchers to construct attenuated strains or subunit vaccines that preserve protective antigens while lowering the risk of vaccine complications, a crucial concern for populations with eczema or immunodeficiency. Similarly, knowledge of the poxvirus life cycle and the viral proteins required for envelope formation and egress made possible the rational design of antivirals such as the small molecule inhibitors developed late in the 20th and early in the 21st century, those that target envelope proteins and block spread within the host. There was, inevitably, a darker edge to this new knowledge. The publication of genomes and the advent of synthetic biology raised questions that the Victorian vaccinators could never have imagined. If a genome sequence could be read, could it be written? In the 2010s, the reconstruction of related orthopox viruses from synthesized DNA, performed in a laboratory context and justified in terms of scientific understanding and preparedness, ignited a fierce debate about whether such work could lower the barriers to recreating variola itself. The debate intersected with policy discussions about the retention of live variola stocks in two repositories, the CDC in Atlanta and the State Research Center of Virology and Biotechnology Vector in Russia, which the World Health Assembly had agreed in principle to destroy but had never finally disposed of. Genomic knowledge promised both salvation and new risks, better diagnostics, vaccines and antivirals on one hand, and on the other hand, a proliferation of tools that could, in unscrupulous hands, be misused. To the historian, all of this looks like a series of nested paradoxes. The instrument of prevention, a simple scratch, became an emblem of state power and elicited fierce resistance. Empires and factories provided the conditions for the virus to spread, even as their infrastructures enabled the vaccine to be manufactured, transported and administered. The very human specificity of variola, which made eradication biomedically feasible, also produced a pathogen whose molecular repertoire was superbly matched to thwart human immunity, until centuries later the same molecular understanding allowed the world to confine it to the history books. The legal and political battles over compulsion, epitomised by a Cambridge courtroom in 1905 and by a British Royal Commission at the turn of the century, did far more than decide policy. They helped to define the modern boundary between individual rights and collective responsibility, a boundary that would be tested again and again by subsequent campaigns against infectious disease. These tensions of liberty and coercion, of empire and humanitarianism, of local belief and global expertise, are not mere backdrops to the biological narrative. They shaped who got vaccinated first, who was left vulnerable, where outbreaks smouldered and where they were stamped out. A vaccinator's cart rolling down a dock lane in 1890 carried not only glass capillaries and tincture, but the entire apparatus of governance, the inspector's list, the municipal ledger, the legal threat of a fine. The same cart a century later might carry a freeze-dried seed vaccine, a titanium needle or a clipboard with case definitions informed by PCR primers designed from sequences only just decoded. The virus, for its part, remained stubbornly indifferent to rhetoric. It obeyed molecular constraints and exploited human networks with equal facility, and it obliged planners to think in terms of logistics at scale. It was easier to tell a compelling moral story about a single mother refusing an instruction than to marshal the supply trains necessary to reach every hamlet of an empire. But in the long run, the supply trains mattered more. In the final accounting of this period of history, the social and the scientific were braided together. The anti-vaccination movements and the legal doctrines that curtailed or permitted compulsion forced public health officials to cultivate consent and to attend to the social determinants of uptake. The imperial age created the transport and administrative architectures that both disseminated the virus and enabled wide-scale campaigns, and the intimate, large and molecularly rich biology of variola was eventually interrogated by genomics in ways that clarified what made the virus uniquely human, and which broken cogs in its genetic machinery produced the most harm. When, through the combined efforts of surveillance law, vaccination campaigns, and eventually molecular vigilance, the world closed the chapter on endemic smallpox, it did so with a clearer sense that the conquest was not purely biomedical. It required politics, law, logistics, trust, and above all a willingness, by many publics, for many different reasons, to accept a common obligation at the point where a needle met flesh. The needle then was never only a medical instrument, it was also a question posed to society. How much coercion will you accept in the name of safety? How much generosity will you ask of strangers? How will you craft law to bind the liberties of the one to the welfare of the many? The smallpox story teaches that these questions are not abstract. They have edges that cut, that scar, and that, in the best of circumstances, heal. And when one looks at variola under the microscope, at the heavy brick of a virion and the long roll of base pairs in its genome, one sees a pathogen exquisitely tuned to human life and human immunology, a pathogen that compelled a vast, often clumsy, and sometimes tender political response. The science pried open the virus's secrets. The politics helped decide whether those secrets were used to coerce or to convince. The law provided the arena where the resulting contest was judged. In the slowly turning, sleepless work of eradication that followed, these strands would be drawn tighter still, until at last the virus's dependence on human hosts became its fatal weakness. The late 1960s felt, in the bureaucracies of Geneva and in the tents and mud huts of distant provinces, like a moment when a long, slow machine was finally set to run at full speed. The World Health Organization, already a somewhat creaky international body of epidemiologists and diplomats, made a new choice. Smallpox was not merely a nuisance or a colonial relic to be managed, it was a target to be hunted down and, if possible, killed off. The formal turning point is tidy on paper. 1967, when the WHO launched an intensified global smallpox eradication campaign, and it had the tidy names that historians like. D.A. Don Henderson to lead the global programme, Marcelino Candau still as Director General in Geneva, and a string of memoranda about budgets and vaccine shipments. But the tidy dates were the thin skin over a much messier reality of people, places and improvisation. The resolution that catalysed action had been in the air for a decade. Soviet proposals in the late 1950s, half-hearted attempts in the 1960s, but 1967 was when funding and leadership converged to change tactics and to demand results. The shift in tactics mattered fundamentally. For years, the orthodox answer had been mass vaccination. Vaccinate whole populations if you can, keep coverage above some threshold, and hope that transmission will collapse. In some settings that worked perfectly. In others it ran into geography, civil strife, migration, suspicion of outsiders, and the simple arithmetic of human life. There were more people than resources. Teams with jet injectors and vans drove into cities and big towns and stamped their numbers into records. But the disease lived at the edges, in hamlets reachable only by river canoe, in nomad encampments along trade routes, in refugee camps, in politically contested regions where vaccination teams could not travel without a small army. Mass campaigns often left gaps. That is what the new intensified WHO effort had to confront. Not only more vaccines, but smarter ways to use them. The smarter way had a pithy name that did not sound revolutionary: surveillance and containment. It would later be romanticised as ring vaccination in popular telling, and for good reason. It was the epidemiological equivalent of picking the fruit you can reach, rather than attempting to clear the whole orchard at once. The idea was both blunt and elegant. Find cases quickly, trace their contacts, vaccinate the immediate ring of exposure and the neighbourhoods and households around them, isolate when necessary. Instead of blanketing populations, you hammer the places where the virus actually moves. It sounds obvious. At the time it was audacious. The practical proof came not from Geneva, but from the dirt roads of West Africa. William H. Fauge, an epidemiologist working with the Centres for Disease Control and Prevention, found himself in the middle of a campaign in Nigeria in the late 1960s where mass vaccination had not halted chains of transmission. Supplies were limited, people were mobile, rumours and resistance hampered teams. Fauge and the local officers realised that catching each case and vaccinating the people most likely to have been exposed stopped the spread far more efficiently than chasing herd immunity numbers that could never be reached. It required intense, almost forensic case finding, calendars of movements, and an army of informants, shopkeepers, schoolteachers, midwives, who would whisper a name as soon as a rash turned up. The strategy succeeded. Not because it was high technology, because it matched the reality on the ground and parcelled resources where they mattered. Adopting that strategy at world scale required a kind of managerial courage. Don Henderson was, in the language of his colleagues, a hard manager with a calm voice. He could scare a national minister of health with a single performance review, but he could also coax fragile donor governments into multi-year commitments. The WHO programme under his direction became a peculiar hybrid of centralised scientific authority and decentralised improvisation. Geneva set the goals and standards and moved money. Regional offices adapted the plan. National programmes executed with local staff. The programme catalogued what worked, then moved it like seed. Surveillance and containment, once validated in Nigeria, was taught in workshops and spread by people rather than documents. An American epidemiologist would spend months training an Indian district officer. A Japanese laboratory scientist would travel to Lagos to standardise potency testing. A Soviet vaccine factory would send crates of freeze-dried vaccine across continents. It is almost comic if you think about it, that through the worst years of the Cold War, the arsenals that otherwise sat pointed at each other were, for once, contributing to the same humane project. Vaccines and money flowing from Moscow and Washington, technical specialists from Geneva and Atlanta and Tokyo, all tacitly agreeing that an ancient virus was a suitable object of their common attention. The international political scene helped, oddly enough. The Cold War created resources and competition that governments could channel into a common trophy: global health prestige. The Soviet Union, which had proposed smallpox eradication in the 1950s, stepped forward with large donations of freeze-dried vaccine and with laboratories willing to supply doses. The United States, through the CDC and other channels, offered epidemiological talent and operational experience. UNICEF and WHO coordinated distribution logistics to countries with exhausted health services. National governments, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Somalia, many African nations, had their own stakes. Smallpox cost lives and legitimacy. The diplomatic oddness of it. Men and women who might normally be described as geopolitical adversaries sending vaccine to the same barnyard of humanity was one of the campaign's quiet ironies. They rarely signed joint press releases about détente. They didn't need to. A vial of freeze-dried vaccinia did not carry an ideological label. Science and simple technology were as important as geopolitics. Two inventions deserve a kind of bedtime reverence. One was the freeze-dried vaccine itself, which could better survive transport and temperature variation. The other was the bifurcated needle, a small two-pronged steel instrument that could hold a minute drop of vaccine and be used with little training. When Benjamin Rubin's invention came into widespread use in the late 1960s, it changed the arithmetic of vaccination. One vial could do many more people. Inexperienced hands could be trained to perform a competent vaccine in minutes, and wastage dropped. Small things do indeed change history. In the field, a bifurcated needle was as revolutionary as a new treaty. But devices and diplomacy do not win eradication on spreadsheets. The daily work, surveillance, contact tracing, persuading a village elder to allow strangers into his compound, was an accumulation of small mercies, small embarrassments and larger acts of improvisation. The frontline teams became a special kind of social worker-detective hybrid, armed with not much more than a canvas bag of needles, a logbook, and the habit of listening. They learned local languages, the names of clan leaders, the routes of market days. They camped in village squares, ate what people ate, and made friends. When they could not get mechanical refrigerators, they wrapped vaccine vials in wet cloth and buried them in earth, or packed them in ice in canvas chests. When vehicles broke down, they hired donkeys. When villages were suspicious, vaccinators found allies among school teachers or imams who could explain in a single sermon that vaccination prevented a fate worse than the inconvenience of a sore arm. It was soft statecraft, tiny concessions, a promise kept, a child's fevered skin inspected and confirmed to be something else. And it mattered. The texture of these operations is best conveyed by the small scenes that repeat themselves around the world. In a dusty riverine town in South Asia, a two-person vigil patrol would turn up at dawn at the home of a woman who had been reported in the rumour network. The vaccinator, eyes tired but steady, would call for water to clean a spot on the forearm, dip the bifurcated needle into a reconstituted drop, and make the 5 quick pricks that left the neat little scar. The assistant would mark the logbook, name, age, house number, then move on. A child would cry for a moment and then be mollified with a sliver of candy. The team would leave a painted mark on the house lintel so that others would know the house had been checked. The mark itself often did more to reassure the village folk than any official certificate. In northern Nigeria, a surveillance officer might ride for days along sand tracks between households, stopping at market days to ask midwives about any fevers with rash. In the afternoon, he would sit on the tailgate of a truck and map, with coloured pins, where the latest cases clustered. There was no glamour, only necessary repetition. Sometimes the work required argument. There were places where vaccination teams were refused entry because of local politics or religion. In a refugee camp where trust was frayed and the air smelled of soap and sorrow, a public information officer would mount a soapbox and tell story after story of smallpox survivors. A midwife might display the smallpox vaccination scar on her own arm as proof. In certain high-profile pockets of resistance, politicians or religious leaders had to be convinced through personal meetings. The negotiator's toolkit was simple: data, patience, and, when necessary, a show of respect. That last is critical. Many teams learned over and over that the procedural etiquette of village life, knocking on the elder's door before entering, offering tea, bowing where appropriate, could do more to open gates than any legal threat from the capital. There were moments of real improvisation that should be preserved in the small liturgy of public health law. In one district, a team's truck sank into mud during a monsoon, and the cold boxes with vaccine were stranded. Rather than return the precious supply, the team lined up local fishermen to ferry vaccine crates downriver to the next town. In an isolated Somali settlement, vaccinators negotiated with a clan leader who feared witchcraft. A respected elder agreed to host an open vaccination session where the children were vaccinated publicly so that suspicion evaporated. These acts were unglamorous, and yet they changed the course of outbreaks. They are also the human detail that textbooks can't fully capture. Human judgment, adaptability, the quick arithmetic of risk when equipment fails and the virus is patient. Those who did the work came from many strata. There were international epidemiologists, disciples of statistical rigour and logbooks, who taught techniques of line listing and case definitions. There were national public health officers, often working with ministry budgets that were thinner than their competence. And there were the uncelebrated local vaccinators, school teachers, midwives, ambulance drivers, agricultural extension officers who learned to pierce with a bifurcated needle and to watch for the faint pox that signalled a case. In the corridors of global health, the presidents of programs and the names of donors are remembered. In villages, the vaccinators are remembered. That memory is sometimes literally embodied by the small round scar on an old man's arm. It is a quiet proof of intervention, a durable badge. Successes accumulated in little precise ways, clusters extinguished, months without a reported case, an exhausted district health officer being allowed to sleep in his own bed again, and in larger milestones that travel through corporate histories. In South Asia, India's of humanity required a choreography of teams, trains and trucks that sometimes reads like a military campaign. Vaccinators were placed at railway stations, on barges, at factory gates. The country's enormous public health machinery, with WHO and donor support, learned to do two things at once: run wide coverage campaigns and maintain the active searching that would detect the last stubborn chains of transmission. Andhra Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar districts that had been the centres of endemic disease became laboratories for refining the mix of mass and targeted vaccination. In Africa, Somalia and Ethiopia presented different challenges. Pastoral mobility, sparse roads and a public health service spread thin. There, success turned on humility and local networks. The very people who knew migration patterns would point out the wells where people gathered and who would let teams pass. And so the last years of the eradication program were a crescendo of containment, not of spectacle. The epidemic curves went down in a map unfurling of red to white. Whole regions that had once been chronicled as hotbeds of disease became quiet statistical white spaces. The WHO's field reports, those dull-sounding telegrams and typed pages, became sacred texts, line lists of individual cases, with names and ages and dates, and the result of lab tests. Recording each case, then closing the ring of vaccination around it, was a kind of ritual exorcism. With each closed chain, the psychological weight of the virus eased. Sometimes the virus would raise its head in a place where everyone thought it had been buried. The endgame is always tricky for pathogens. As numbers fall, it becomes harder to find the few remaining cases, and the social salience of the disease declines, even as fragility increases. In 1977, the world had some reason for cautious optimism. Global incidence fell dramatically year by year. By the mid-1970s, there were only a handful of endemic areas left. Yet the final extinguishing of naturally occurring smallpox would require one last set of careful operations. That last naturally acquired case came on the 26th of October 1977 in Merka, often written Merka, a town on the Indian Ocean coast of Somalia. The patient who has entered the annals of public health history was Ali Mao Marlin. He was a hospital worker, one of those men who serve the daily needs of a district hospital, and his infection read like the closing line of a long drama. He fell ill, he was recognised, teams swarmed, the contacts were traced and vaccinated, the ring closed. He survived. He recovered. It is striking and perhaps poignant that the final human body to manifest naturally transmitted smallpox did not die from it. The virus's last gasp in the wild was not a heroic battle, but a quiet, contained episode. Marlin later joined the public health effort he had once embarrassed inadvertently. The irony is not lost. The last smallpox patient became part of the workforce that made sure there would be no more. But eradication does not declare itself on the basis of a single case and a solemn press release. It required verification, painstaking, methodical, sometimes bureaucratic scrutiny that would convince scientists and ministers alike that the disease was indeed gone. WHO established a process of regional and global certification. Regional committees, composed of independent experts who visited countries, combed through case records, examined hospital logs, and often conducted active case searches. They scrutinized surveillance archives, the line list that recorded every suspected and confirmed case, the laboratory tests that had isolated virus, the vaccination records that showed coverage and the chain of investigation for each last cluster. Each claim had to be corroborated by evidence beyond a neat letter asserting, "No more cases here." That process was bureaucratic, and that is part of what made it credible. When the last cases in Somalia were reviewed and the Regional Certification Commission for Africa was satisfied, the dossier moved upward. The Global Commission for the Certification of Smallpox Eradication, composed of senior international experts, examined the regional findings. Frank Fenner, the Australian virologist whose career included leading the team that controlled myxomatosis in rabbits, chaired the Global Commission. The Commission did not take the decision lightly. It examined epidemiological data, laboratory archives and field visits. It understood that declaring a disease eradicated was not merely a scientific statement, but a political act with enormous consequences. Vaccination policies would change, laboratories would change what projects they prioritized, and resources would be reallocated. The Commission had to be sure. Between the last natural case in Somalia in October 1977 and the global pronouncement followed a year of hairline tracing and global administrative hygiene. The period included an event that underscored the logic of caution. On the 11th of September 1978, Janet Parker, a medical photographer at the University of Birmingham Medical School in England, became infected with smallpox in what was later determined to be a laboratory-acquired infection. She died, and with her death the news media reread the story of smallpox and its capacity to surprise. The Birmingham incident produced inquiries, recriminations, and immediate tightening of laboratory containment measures. It did not, however, negate the evidence that there were no longer naturally circulating viruses in human populations. The distinction mattered. A lab accident, horrific as it was, is not the same epidemiological condition as endemic human transmission. Still, it forced the global community to give extra attention to the question of remaining virus stocks and laboratory safeguards. It took diplomatic patience and scientific rigour to turn the technical finding, no naturally occurring smallpox, since late 1977, into a political consensus. Regional certification commissions issued their reports. The Global Commission consolidated them and made a recommendation. The World Health Assembly, the governing body of WHO, gathered in May 1980. On the 8th of May 1980, the Assembly accepted the Commission's report. Halfdan T. Mahler, the WHO Director General at the time, made the formal pronouncement. The words used were exacting and unadorned, befitting an era of professional normality. Smallpox was eradicated. There were cheers, yes, but the moment was more like a clearing of breath than a trumpet fanfare. Frank Fenner, who had chaired the commission, later reflected on the meaning. Humanity had, for the first time, rid itself of a major disease. That sentence, simple and enormous, captures the sheer oddity of the occasion. A virus that had stalked humans for thousands of years had been reduced to a name in a history book. The verification process, the audits of line lists, the field visits, the lab checks, left behind an archive of its own. Contained the surveillance records, the correspondence, the case histories. Those archives have been invaluable to later historians and to epidemiologists, because they contain the granular data about how a global campaign actually proceeds, not just the success, but the stumbles. The Commission's reports, too, recorded the institutional learning, the central importance of local knowledge, the necessity of flexible logistics, the power of a single simple device like the bifurcated needle, and the political truth that global cooperation was possible even when geopolitics was poisonous. The declaration of eradication did not end all debate. Questions remained about what to do with the remaining stocks of variola virus held in laboratories. There was for a time an uneasy mixture of desire to study the virus for vaccines and diagnostics and fear about accidental release. The Birmingham tragedy made the latter fear more acute. The eventual path would be consolidation of variola stocks under strict security in very few labs and continuing debate about destruction. But the immediate task, stopping natural transmission, was done. The world, at least officially, could stop vaccinating universally against smallpox, investing instead in surveillance for an eventual flare and maintaining laboratory containment where necessary. It is worth ending these nights, these slow recountings, by reflecting on what eradication looked like up close. It was not a single great victory, so much as tens of thousands of small, competent acts. A health worker persuading a reluctant family to allow a vaccine, a driver keeping a box of vaccine chilled in a broken refrigerator by the simple expedient of switching the ice every few hours, an epidemiologist painstakingly reconstructing a chain of contacts after a market day exposed dozens of people to the virus, a director in Geneva juggling donor timelines and personnel rotations until the money flowed at exactly the right moment. It was also an international choreography rarely seen elsewhere in the Cold War era. Scientists and bureaucrats from ideologically opposed capitals agreeing to the slow, patient, repetitive business of counting cases and vaccinating contacts. There is a subtle, dry irony in that last observation. The rivalry between superpowers produced many things, spies, missiles, proxy wars, but it also produced resources and an ethos of competition that could be channeled into public health. Smallpox eradication capitalized on that paradox. The disease, which had been an unintentional constant companion of humanity, was confronted by a global coalition that marshaled political will, simple inventions, local know-how, and stubborn persistence. The result, declared in May 1980, remains one of the clearest illustrations in history that coordinated human effort, everyday pragmatism matched with large-scale organization, can expunge a biological foe from the living world. So when one thinks of the WHO campaign and its late 1960s intensification, it is worth keeping together the two images. The calm offices in Geneva where plans and budgets were carved out with stationary and temperate voices, and the dusty lanes where vaccinators moved door to door with bifurcated needles and damp cloths protecting vaccine vials. Both worlds were necessary. Both made smallpox a disease of the past. The calm of those final years, months of steady reporting, quiet rings closed, and finally, the last case in Somalia, has about it a bedtime feeling, a kind of exhausted peace, the way a city settles after a long storm. Perhaps because it was won not by spectacle but by persistence and thrift, the smallpox eradication campaign is, in the ledger of human accomplishments, one of the few items to date that any nation, any polity, can legitimately call its common triumph. When the last wild case of ordinary smallpox was recorded in a hospital in Merka, Somalia, on an October day in 1970, the patient, a cook named Ali Mao Marlin, who would later become a vaccinator and an emblem of the strange mercy of survival. The world sighed and applauded, and then turned the problem of the thing in its hands into a question of custody. The disease that had burned through cities and countrysides for centuries had been driven from daily life by people in boots and turbans, in municipal uniforms, by church groups, by nurses with vaccine boxes in the hot sun, by awkward motorbikes and diligent record books, and by a stubborn core of epidemiologists baptized into the discipline of surveillance and containment. Victory was declared in 1980 by the World Health Assembly, and the map of endemic smallpox went white where once it had been blotched red. But absence is a delicate thing. It asks whether what you remove should be destroyed, stored, memorialized, or kept under glass in case it might teach you something new tomorrow. That question, whether to consign live variola virus to flame or to lock it under the most rigorous guard for the sake of future research, is the long, technical, moral quarrel that followed the last patient. It was not a quarrel born only of idealism or caution. It was shaped by vivid recent examples that made the debate urgent and sometimes febrile. In 1978, a medical photographer in Birmingham, Janet Parker, contracted smallpox from an apparently licensed laboratory and died. Her case reopened the tender wound in public confidence about laboratory safety and the notion that the virus could be safely kept anywhere at all. On the other hand, scientists and security planners who read the world with a ledger worried about the future. What if someone needed antivirals or better diagnostics for a variant? Or what if a malevolent actor, the sort the Cold War had taught governments to fear, deployed a forgotten virus against the unvaccinated? And then there was the revealed history of the Soviet biopreparat program, exposed in the early 90s by defectors like Ken Alibek, who told the West that clandestine caches and weaponization efforts had taken place. Those revelations added a geopolitical shadow to the ethical one, the knowledge that the formal story of two safe repositories, one at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, and one at the State Research Center of Virology and Biotechnology, Vector, in Koltsovo, Russia, might not be the whole story, and that even if it were, trust between states was in short supply. In the halls of Geneva, the problem was argued as a diplomatic and scientific puzzle. The World Health Organization, which had shepherded the eradication, had to balance competing imperatives. On one hand, there was an almost liturgical desire for closure. Destroy the last live virus, make the planet unequivocally free, consign the biological instrument of centuries of death to ashen memory. On the other hand, there were the technocratic counsellings of scientists who pointed out that many elements of biodefence, antivirals, improved vaccines for immunocompromised people, highly specific diagnostics, could benefit from research using the real agent. You could work with vaccinia and surrogate orthopox viruses and increasingly with molecular fragments and gene sequences, but there were particular questions, they said, that could only be answered by variola itself. Which viral genes dictated its narrow tropism for humans? Which markers best discriminated historic strains in an outbreak? Would a future antiviral developed in vitro actually work against the living organism in a whole animal model? Those were not rhetorical questions. They were the dry, precise language of grant applications, pharmaceutical pipelines, and national security assessments. The WHO's answer, in practice, became a compromise that satisfied neither absolutists nor cautious realists entirely. Physical stocks were consolidated into two officially recognized repositories, the CDC in Atlanta and Vector in Koltsovo, and strict oversight regimes were established. Laboratories elsewhere were requested to transfer any variola holdings they might lawfully possess to one of these two centers or destroy them. Later, in the late 1990s, the WHO convened an advisory committee on variola virus research that would vet proposals and set priorities for any experiments that required live virus. Access would be tightly controlled, Research would proceed only under the strictest biosafety and biosecurity conditions, with inspections, inventory audits, and an international paper trail. It was a modern secular sacrament. Permission to touch was granted by a committee sworn to both science and prudence. The inspections and governance that evolved were forensic in nature. The repositories had to meet containment standards comparable to those used for the most dangerous agents, and periodic WHO missions reviewed records, security measures, and the scientists' rationales. Proposals to remove a sample from its repository for a specific study had to be justified on narrow grounds. The committee weighed whether the expected benefit of each sanctioned experiment outweighed the risks of handling and transport. In this way, by reducing physical availability, insisting upon strict containment and tying each use to approved time-limited research goals, the international system attempted to thread a needle between the humanitarian desire to eliminate a threat and the pragmatic desire to be prepared if anything similar were ever to arise. Even as the debate continued, work went forward on the very things that had justified retention: better vaccines, improved diagnostics and antiviral drugs. The vaccine landscape, oddly, reflected both the past and the future. The post-eradication era had ended routine universal vaccination, but it did not end research. For decades, the standard vaccine had been Dryvax, a calf lymph-derived live vaccinia vaccine that had saved countless lives but also carried risks of serious adverse events. In the first decades of the 21st century, driven in part by the renewed attention to bio-threats after the anthrax attacks of 2001, the United States replenished and modernized its stockpile. ACAM 2000, a cell-cultured replication-competent vaccinia vaccine, was licensed in 2007 as a direct descendant of the old stock, intended for limited use by the military and by some laboratory personnel. Separately, efforts to create safer, non-replicating options bore fruit. A modified vaccinia Ankara strain produced by Bavarian Nordic and known variously as Imvanex, Imvamune, or Jynneos was developed as an attenuated vaccine with fewer side effects, and by the late 2010s it had licensing for use against both smallpox and related orthopox viruses. These vaccines, developed and validated in part through study of orthopox biology and animal models that benefited from access to variola or its genomic information, offered a layer of reassurance that destructive finality had once argued against. If a future exposure occurred, modern countermeasures might be better and safer. Antiviral development, once an afterthought in an age when vaccination had been the tool of choice, became a central justification for retaining samples. The antiviral cidofovir, used off-label and investigated in small studies, was one early candidate with some in vitro activity against orthopox viruses. More novel compounds followed. Tecovirimat ST246, later sold as TPO-XX, was developed to target a viral envelope protein required for dissemination within the host. It was an engineered modern drug, tested in animal models and approved by the US Food and Drug Administration under the Animal Rule in 2018, giving health officials a pharmaceutical remedy that had not existed during the eradication campaigns. Brincidofovir, also called CMX-01 and later marketed as Tembexa, is another drug that was eventually licensed for smallpox. Both drugs had been evaluated because researchers could better understand the virus's replication and protein function by studying variola and closely related orthopox viruses. Each regulatory approval was a quiet answer to the question posed in Geneva. Keeping the virus allowed us to build a better shield. Diagnostics too were transformed. Molecular biology, which matured in the decades after eradication, made rapid PCR-based detection possible, and full or partial genomic sequences of variola strains became key reference points for designing primers and discriminating variola from other orthopox infections. Sequencing itself, the act of reading the virus's letters, created another ethical problem. When variola genomes began to appear in public databases in the 90s and 2000s, many celebrated the scientific openness that would accelerate countermeasure development. Others alarmed. If the complete recipe of the virus was publicly accessible, might it be possible for a determined laboratory to reconstruct critical elements or even, in principle, synthesize an orthopox agent. This was no longer mere philosophy, but a tangible technological worry. As DNA synthesis technology improved and became more widely available, the possibility that sequence information could be misused meant that the debate about physical stocks acquired a twin strand: information governance. The creation of industry-led screening frameworks, such as those later promoted by the International Gene Synthesis Consortium, and the development of national policies for DNA order screening were, in part, reactions to that new reality. Throughout, the question of destruction versus retention never went away. Delegates to successive World Health Assemblies raised the idea of destroying the two remaining official stocks as a symbolic and practical shield-to-one listener act, but no final global consensus ever hardened into immediate incineration. The arguments were persistent and familiar. Destruction would be irreversible. Retention allowed further uncertain but potentially life-saving research. Neither action eliminated the possibility that an illicit or forgotten cache existed somewhere. And in an age of gene synthesis, destroying the physical virus might be more ceremonial than protective. Those who argued for destruction sometimes couched their plea in plain human feeling. The world had suffered enough. Let the species be done with the thing that had so often split families and cities. Those who argued for retention invoked the precepts of preparedness and prudence. Science is a long game, and the costs of being unprepared could be catastrophic. That moral architecture of restraint plus readiness, of central custodianship and strict oversight shaped the post-eradication world. The fold of containment and the network of inspections remained in place. Laboratories elsewhere were routinely audited, and the two repositories became the rarest kind of museum. Places where live organisms of a vanished disease are kept not as trophies, but as potential keys. The ethical dilemmas lingered. Who gets to determine whether a study is essential? How do we assess benefits that are hypothetical and risks that are immediate? Can the world ever be fully confident that all stocks, declared and undeclared, are accounted for? And when the science advances, as it inevitably does, who decides which experiments cross the threshold from beneficial to reckless? If this is the technical and political aftermath, there is also the quieter cultural one. The long shadow of smallpox on memory, on art and on the social imagination. Smallpox was not merely a series of outbreaks to be plotted on epidemiological maps. It was visible on faces, woven into family lore, written into diaries and hammered into stone. In an age before cameras were common, painted portraits often showed the geometry of pockmarks, and a pitted face was a personal history map, a private inscription of illness and survival. In an age when photography came into being, daguerreotypes and later portraits preserved the small puckered hills of healed pustules, the faded round of a vaccination scar that had been a survivor's badge and later a bureaucratic certifying mark. The scar from vaccination, a small circular indentation usually on the upper arm, became an odd kind of status symbol in some places, proof of immunity and of participation in modern medicine, and in other places a scarred reminder of vulnerability. Writers and commentators recorded the social consequences. Survivors bore rhetorical and practical scars. The pox could shape marriage prospects, social standing and daily interaction. In some communities, a survivor could be revered as a person who had cheated death. In others, they were excluded, treated with a mixture of fear and superstition. Smallpox could be religiously codified. In parts of India and Bangladesh, the deity Shitala Mata was worshipped as both cause and protector against the fever and the rash, and ritual observances and songs were part of how communities made sense of outbreaks. Folk remedies, rituals of purification, and local healing practices existed alongside the clinic and the inoculation tent. The campaign to introduce variolation in England in the early 18th century, and later vaccination in the late 18th century, did not merely displace a disease, it intruded into moral economies and household beliefs. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who in 1717 observed Ottoman inoculation practices in Constantinople and later advocated them in England, is one historically specific figure whose letters helped bridge worlds. And then, decades later, Edward Jenner's famous experiment in 1796, inoculating young James Phipps with cowpox material taken from a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms, became shorthand for a new form of prevention, one that would eventually turn the world away from routine variolation toward a safer, more modern prophylactic. Museums became repositories not only of virus samples but of artefacts of everyday public health. The Wellcome Collection in London, the National Library of Medicine in Bethesda, the Smithsonian, and the CDC's own museum in Atlanta hold instruments, vaccination kits, posters and photographs from the era of inoculation and eradication, lacquered flasks, advertisements exhorting mothers to bring their children to vaccination stations, the wooden boxes that held bifurcated needles. These objects are small and domestic, and yet they tell a large story about how a public health program sits at the intersection of state policy, local custom, and individual courage. Oral history projects collected the voices of vaccinators and villagers, truck drivers and rationers, giving texture to what might otherwise be only éter: names, routes, towns. The WHO archives and national libraries contain interviews with the field workers who remembered being bitten by mosquitoes, walking for miles to reach a remote village, or arguing with a local elder until the household let the team in. These narratives teach us that the eradication required not only thermostated fridges and syringes, but persuasion, ceremony, and sometimes compromise. Eradication changed popular perceptions. Where once the recurring fevers of smallpox had been viewed as inevitable, or fated, or elemental, the disappearance of the disease gave the public a new vocabulary of manageability and success. The idea that an infectious disease could be fully eliminated from the surface of the planet was no longer purely theoretical. That conviction inspired other campaigns. It gave momentum to the Global Polio Eradication Initiative launched in 1988, informed the later campaign that would finish Rinderpest in 2011, and helped choose eradication as a policy aim for other programs: guinea worm, yaws, and beyond. But it also bred a certain hubris, a belief that human will and administrative competence alone could subdue biological reality. Where that belief met politics, poverty, and nature, it sometimes found limits. Polio, stubborn in places like parts of Nigeria, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, reminded the world that eradication is not only about biology, it is also about access, trust, and security. Measles resurfaced in communities that had lost faith in vaccination, or in systems that had failed to maintain universal coverage. The celebrations that followed smallpox's disappearance were not an end of the story but a prelude, a lesson contained in relief urging later generations to remember those features of smallpox that made it conquerable, and those aspects of human society that made victory so difficult. From all these histories come practical lessons for any future attempt to control or erase a pathogen. The first is surveillance. A disease you cannot see is a disease you cannot control. Smallpox's success owed much to the development of a global network of surveillance that could triangulate an outbreak, send a team, and measure the circle of exposure. William H. Foge's contribution, the innovation of surveillance containment, or the ring vaccination approach, is a concrete and operational lesson. Instead of trying to vaccinate everyone everywhere immediately, identify cases, trace contacts, and draw a biological cordon around infection. It was a cost-effective surgical strategy that made the best use of scarce resources in countries where mass vaccination was infeasible. Surveillance, it turned out, is a moral technology as much as a technical one. It requires boots in the field, laboratory confirmation, rapid reporting, and a bureaucracy that can translate data into action. The second is political will. Successful eradication is a project of governance as much as it is a matter of vaccines and needles. National political commitment, the backing of ministries, military logistics when roads are impassable, and the steadiness to continue operations across elections was decisive. India's campaign in the early 70s is a canonical example of how central government commitment, allied with state-level administration and WHO support, turned the tide. Without money, transport, and the willingness to set targets and review them candidly, programs drift. Where political will faltered, so did the chances of success. Third is equity and trust. The smallpox campaigns taught public health officers that communities are not passive vessels into which one pours medical benevolence. They are actors with beliefs, fears, and histories. Where teams worked with local leaders, religious figures, and trusted health workers, vaccination acceptance rose. Where outsiders ignored local concerns or used coercive methods, distrust spread, and with it, the disease. Polio's difficulties have been instructive here too. In northern Nigeria in the early 2000s, a crisis of confidence, rumours about vaccine safety and about foreign interference, led to a boycott that had regional consequences. Community engagement, culturally informed communication, and the inclusion of local actors in planning are not soft extras. They are core technical elements of any eradication strategy. Fourth is the need for sustained social and scientific investment. Eradication is not a sprint that finishes in a single budget cycle. It is a long march that requires training field workers, maintaining cold chains, building laboratories, and financing the supply chains for vaccines and drugs. It demands institutions that can preserve and hand off the institutional memory of campaigns when personnel change. The infrastructure that makes a program possible, surveillance networks, laboratories, trained epidemiologists, logistic capabilities, is also the infrastructure that pays dividends for routine health. It is what enables countries to respond to measles outbreaks, to track tuberculosis trends, and to begin to prepare for pandemics. A narrow focus on a single target disease without strengthening the health system around it is a brittle strategy. Fifth is humility about the limits of eradication itself. Smallpox succeeded because it met a very particular set of criteria. A clinically distinctive illness that left a visible scar, no animal reservoir, an effective vaccine conferring durable immunity, and social conditions amenable to tracing and containment. Many other pathogens do not check those boxes. Measles, for example, though theoretically eradicable because it has a human-only reservoir, requires extremely high herd immunity levels to prevent transmission. Polio, though also human-limited, throws up the technical difficulty of vaccine-derived strains that can circulate in under-immunized populations. Malaria, with its animal and vector complexities, is not a candidate for eradication with the tools we have. Good public health policy must therefore be discriminating. Eradication should be pursued only when the biological, technical, social and political conditions make it feasible, and when the benefits justify the cost. Finally, the smallpox experience speaks to governance for the foreseeable future in an age of biotechnology. The question that bedeviled Geneva in the 1980s, whether to destroy the last virus, looks different in a world where gene synthesis and synthetic biology make the assembly of genetic pieces easier. Information governance, oversight of dual-use research, DNA order screening by synthesis companies, stronger systems of transparency between states, and robust biosafety standards are part of the modern answer. The obligations are global. A hole in one country's laboratory security can be a hole everywhere. Thus, the lessons are institutional. Invest in high-level science, yes, but also in the mechanisms that ensure safety, in norms for responsible research, and in the political structures that support cooperation even when politics is difficult. Smallpox, in its long stubborn life and in its eventual removal from the wild, taught a generation that humans can, under the right conditions, extinguish an infectious disease. It also taught us that such a task is never purely technical. It is social, ethical, political, and cultural. The last live viruses remain under guard in 2 repositories. The knowledge gleaned from them has produced safer vaccines and the first effective antivirals, but it has also left open the disquieting questions of who may judge the need for future experiments and how we weigh hypothetical benefit against immediate risk. The museums keep the needles and the posters. The oral histories keep the voices of the vaccinators. The portraits and photographs keep the faces that once bore the pox. The the eradication changed how people think of the possible. It made global health engineers bolder, countries more willing to pledge money and troops to public health, and communities more likely to think that human cooperation might, in rare moments, overcome a deep biological adversary. But the story closes not with a triumphant full stop, but with a softer, more cautious punctuation. Eradication is a model and a muse, not a universal formula. It requires vigilance, the capacity to learn and change, and a willingness to invest in systems that produce both equity and resilience. It requires scientists who act with humility and policymakers who act with patience. It requires communities whom health programs serve as partners, not merely subjects. Smallpox disappeared from the world because of a precise combination of epidemiology, technology, politics, and human improvisation. Those elements remain essential. Future pandemics will test our capacity to put surveillance at the front of our response, to deploy targeted interventions that respect culture and rights, and to sustain political commitments over years rather than months. They will test whether we can govern knowledge in a way that fosters life rather than enabling harm. The map that once showed the world spotted red is white now, and that whiteness is not merely the absence of disease, it is also a repository of lessons, a cautionary room lined with the tools and the mistakes of the past. In the quiet that followed eradication, laboratory doors locked, museum cases were dusted, oral histories were recorded, and committees met in Geneva, in Atlanta, and in Kosovo to decide how best to steward memory and risk. We keep the virus under glass because we are afraid and because we are prudent. We keep the stories in our mouths because memory is antiseptic in its own way. It prevents us from being complacent. The smallpox virus may lie confined, but its shadow is long and instructive. When the lights go down on the world's hospitals and the vaccinators fold their tents, the lesson of smallpox remains like a small lamp at the bedside. Vigilance, humility, community, and science in equal measure. Sleep then, but sleep with that lamp lit.